So excited to give the warmest welcome to Ethan Summers. Fun fact, he's one of our chief of staff members of the community. So he's here sharing his wonderful wisdom and knowledge with us. And this is a treat because the community, we haven't had a workshop that's solely focused on go-to-market and sales. So this is key for us as chief of staffs, and I'm so excited to bring together the one and the only Ethan Summers. Passing it off to you, Ethan.
That is a heck of an intro to follow. I'm really excited to meet everyone. Happy to be here. Been a big fan of the Ask a Chief of Staff community since I left the startup I was in, and I took a summer off to figure out what I wanted to do next. And as I stumbled across the Chief of Staff role, I got to know Clara and the community, and it's just been such a resource. So just excited to be able to help out anywhere I can. I was just discussing before we started, there's probably maybe 20 minutes of actual content for me to work through. You'll see it's kind of blocked out in 3 stages. There's the setup or the background. There's the actual toolkit, the go-to-market toolkit that I like to follow. And then there's just some resources, examples. And what I'm hoping for is tons and tons of discussion. I have a tendency to talk really fast. So if I say something and you want me to go back, please ask. If you want to ask a question, just jump in. I'm very much a fan of just radical transparency, and I'm the middle of 5 boys from a military family, so you're never going to hurt my feelings jumping in and asking something. With that said, right before we dive in, or as we dive in, obviously today we're focused on helping your principal lead go-to-market sales. It's a really tricky thing for someone like me for a lot of reasons. First, I'm very introverted by nature. Second, I'm very much an operations person by nature. So all this front-facing, client-facing stuff was kind of weird. And then it's something that y'all will hear in my story. I've failed at multiple times before, sometimes on a big scale. But I share all that because what that's done for me is it's made me just learn it. I have no natural aptitude for it at all. I've just had to learn it. And that's what I want to share with y'all as we have this discussion today is this is extremely learnable. There is a rigorous process to follow. There is a playbook. There are standards. There's standard progressions. We all love market charts and knowing what to do next, and all that's there. So that's the basis I'm coming in from. I always like to define success up front. I think we're successful today if we all know a lot more about go-to-market strategy and sales than when we started. Some highlights we'll cover: my background in supply chain ops and startups, sharing the foundation for my current company's success story and why that informs so much of what we'll talk about, defining what I even mean by go-to-market and sales. Even that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. I'll go ahead and give you all my toolkit for it. We'll explore the stages of a company depending on where your company is and what that means for go-to-market. I'll share some resources for developing your own toolkit because, to be honest, I shamelessly stole this from smarter, better people than me. And then hopefully lots and lots of open discussion. So diving in, I'm a big believer that struggle is the best teacher. Like I said, I'm an introverted supply chain operator with a degree in journalism. I've led 2, I'll say, failed ventures, and along the way got pretty good at go-to-market strategy. But just so you know where I came from, earned my education at the University of Alabama, pivoting out of engineering because I hated that, into journalism because I didn't know what else to do in life, and ended up earning my MBA in what I call venture operations, which makes more sense now. In 2012, when I was getting it set up, it didn't really make a lot of sense to people, but it's all the back end finance and ops and people and stuff that goes into making a new venture real that founders don't like to spend a lot of time or attention on. Spent some time working in big corporations right out of school, worked for a company called Georgia Pacific, and then for UAB Medicine, which is a major healthcare system, getting really, really good at supply chain, getting really, really good at operations excellence, and really learning that giant corporations just aren't the right spot for me. Ended up at a startup called Fledging, went over there in 2019, took a gigantic pay cut to work for a startup that had just raised about $1 million. And what they did was they invented consumer electronics products. Their entire mission was consumer electronics for everyone. The idea was that you should be able to have Apple grade products without paying Apple prices. I joined just as an operations leader, or to help operations. I became an operations leader. And then in August of 2020, I became CEO, which is not something I was ever aiming for. Never had any aspirations to be a CEO, but the 2 founders, they really hit a pretty severe burnout. And this was August of 2020. So it was right after COVID will be over by summer, and right at the start of, oh God, will COVID ever be over? And we had 12 full-time team members. Everyone had salaries, not good ones, but they did have salaries. They had health insurance, and I joined just to stabilize the business so that they could go find other jobs. We thought we would give the money back to the investors, help people offboard, and be done by Christmas. I ended up running that for 2.5 years. We launched a bunch of products. I raised money. In a lot of ways, we almost made it. To date, we have a charger product that I helped design, source, launch, do all of, that I think is one of the coolest products I've ever used, that I made or that someone else made. And we very nearly made it, but we didn't. A common story with startups, at the end of the day, supply chain, cash flow management got us, which is another way of saying our go-to-market strategy got us. Left from there to a venture studio to work on a knowledge transfer platform called Exteli. Inherited this MVP that was pre-designed with this fast follower concept. Didn't have the right resources, didn't have a right clear go-to-market strategy. So I'm sitting there kind of 0 for 2, saying, hey, I'm hearing a lot of things that kind of sound like go-to-market. This keeps really, really hurting what I'm trying to do. I should get smarter on this topic. I like strategy. I like designing and standing stuff up, like all chiefs of staff, I think, do. And I said, hey, maybe that's something I could actually become really good at. In the meantime, I was able to start teaching in an entrepreneurship college here in Birmingham. And then I had this wonderful opportunity to partner with a health tech accelerator where I got to work with hundreds of students and dozens of startups teaching go-to-market strategy, earning lots of rapid feedback, saying dumb things and getting critiqued for it, and then helping people scale their revenue from $5,000 a year to $50,000 a month. And overall, just got to be pretty good at understanding how to develop and teach the go-to-market side of things. That's a lot of where I'm coming from. I'll pause there because again, I've been talking a lot already. Any immediate questions, comments, anything I can clarify before we talk about what I'm doing now? Cool. So what am I doing now? I am chief of staff for a company called Empirix Partners. We're a consultancy. If you're familiar with the construction space, we're kind of like an owner's rep, but for supply chain. And what we do is we come in and we design, manage, and execute supply chain programs, for people that build data centers. If you pay attention to the news or especially LinkedIn at all, you're seeing tons of growth in the data center space. There's going to be 60 or 70 gigawatts coming online in the next 5 years, which, just to give you a sense of the market, there's maybe 7 or 8 gigawatts of total capacity right now. So just headed for explosive growth. We come in, we manage their supply, we help them scale their portfolios, we help them recover capital so they can redeploy it for growth, and we overall act as the trusted advisor so that they always have a chief procurement team on hand. I remember my boss, who's a good friend of mine, he's the CEO, texting me in March of 2023 saying, hey, I have this crazy idea. And I say, well, that's stupid. All right, we'll see what comes of that. And then he texts me again in May and says, hey, I've got some strategy questions. And I kind of work with him some. And then he calls me in August and he says, hey, I started this company in March. This is getting real. I know how to do the technical stuff. He's incredible at supply chain management, but he doesn't know how he wants to approach the market. So I go up and spend a couple days. And when I've been doing this advisory work before, normally I'll get maybe 5 questions in before I come across something that a founder's not thought about, which is kind of troubling, right? You're sitting there talking to someone and you're asking them a basic question like, who's your ideal customer? And they say, what's that? I got 400 questions deep. Literally, I had a list 400 questions deep before I threw him on something. And that inspired a lot of confidence in me. And so he came to me and said, hey, why don't you come on board as my chief of staff? And I said, well, I watched The West Wing, so I kind of know what that is. And I like to do operations work, so I kind of know what you're talking about. But you're hiring me really early. I would be your 3rd employee. You've got like 60 grand in revenue. You don't really have product market fit. I like this because we're private equity backed, kind of a trust fund startup, if you will. So I like it because I get to get paid a lot of money, but I'm not sure I see the fit. And he said, I need someone on my team who's flexible, who can challenge me, who understands go-to-market strategy, and likes to stand stuff up and hand it off to somebody else. I said, that makes perfect sense. So that was October of last year that I joined. And since then, we have grown explosively. We've signed 110x the revenue this year that we signed last year in our founding year. We're expecting to at least double that in 2025. And you can see the flight path. It was late in Q2 where I went and really did that first go-to-market plan and they had their first revenue. I joined middle of Q4. By Q1 of this year, we'd increased our revenue a little. By Q2, a lot. By Q3, a ton. And by Q4 right now, we're at that 110x mark. I can say with really, really high confidence that this is because of go-to-market focus. This isn't all because of me. That's not my claim here. It's because of what I think is a really important relationship between the principal and the chief of staff on systematically and rigorously defining and executing against our go-to-market focus, and then reviewing and updating that as we learn in real time. We say no to much, much more than we say yes to. And I think if y'all are supporting a principal right now, you're either very lucky or more likely you have to constantly be talking them down from things. And what I like about the go-to-market toolkit I'm going to share is it equips everyone with a pre-agreed called an experimental approach to how we're going to do things, but more importantly, what we're not going to do. So this is where I'm coming from, and this is, I think, where I've made a lot of mistakes before, and also have been able to create some success with this toolkit. Okay. So I think it's important right away to define what is go-to-market strategy. What does that mean? Different people say different things. I have really strong opinions when people talk about strategy. My wife jokes all the time, I'm just basically a beard with a stack of opinions laid under it. But the way I define go-to-market strategy is it's your hypothesis for how to connect with your ideal customer and your profitable product. Couple things there. Your ideal customer is that hell yes customer. It's that perfect, probably fictional customer who loves everything about you and everything you do, and they come to you to pay you more money so that you can do more stuff for them. And then I say profitable product because the story of Fledging's failure was ultimately the story of us selling lots of something, just not being able to sell it at a profitable price. So I think that's really important for us to remember is it's part of our job, guiding the strategy to make sure that we're keeping an eye on whatever counts for profitable in our space so that we can continue growing and doing what we need to do. The way I think about strategy, tactics, and operations can also be a little different. I think strategy is that directional, adaptable, more qualitative approach to creating a unique position in the market. Tactics are the overall broad steps, a little more quantitative and practical of how you're going to get there. So more of the actual plan. And then operations is the day-to-day. How do I run this function? How do I run that function to set it up? So when I say strategy, I'm very much meaning that thing on the left. There's a really good example from when John F. Kennedy was proposing the moon landing, the moon program to Congress. He said, we want to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade and bring him home safely. I think that's a great example of strategy. You know what you're doing, you know why you're doing it, you know what success looks like, but you've not sat there and penned down all the little steps. That would be more of tactical or tactics. You got to make some key decisions. Am I going to use a rocket to put him on the moon, or am I building a giant slingshot? Where do we want to launch from? How long do we want this visit to be? What's the proof we want to bring home? And then operations boils down to your processes and checklists. How are we doing check-ins? Did we pack enough supplies? What's the checklist for launch and stuff like that? So this is what I mean by go-to-market strategy, is creating that unique position of approach to connect your best customer with your profitable product. Any questions or different points of view on that before we charge ahead? Because this is the foundation for the rest of today. So I believe deeply that go-to-market strategy is simple. It becomes complicated because people don't want to stick to something. They don't want to give up all these other things. But I think there's 4 deeply interconnected elements. And the first is what we call the strategic intent. That's that simple statement that aligns every team member and partner with the outcome you need to achieve. And I already teased this by sharing, put a man on the moon by the end of the decade and bring him home safely. That's a fantastic strategic intent because it's so actionable for everyone. The head of Space Command knows what to do. The engineers know what to do. The safety specialist knows what to do. Congress knows what to fund or not to fund. Everyone can make day-to-day decisions because they understand so clearly what we're trying to achieve with our go-to-market strategy. And we see this a lot depending on what your business is with stuff like social networks. They're not as revenue and profit focused for a long time. They're extremely focused on recruiting new members because that's the key success metric. Do I have enough other members to make this network successful? Other businesses have other intents, but it's incredibly important to set this North Star when you start because it just informs everything downstream. This can be a really rigorous process. It can be a really challenging process. Typically, if I'm helping someone with go-to-market setup and I spend 2 days with them, we will spend more than half a day really, really getting aligned on the strategic intent. It's just incredibly important. From there, you want to define that ideal customer persona. This can seem a little out of order. It can kind of seem like, hey, shouldn't I know who my customer is before I define my strategic intent? And they do go hand in hand. They very much inform each other. And so that's an important note with these stages is if you get into your ICP and all this homework shows there's one of these and it's not profitable, you're gonna have to go back to your strategic intent. We use that moon landing example. If we had somehow defined that this was going to cost $2 trillion in the 1960s to achieve this, well, the American people aren't going to pay that. So you do have to go back up a step. But the ICP is a pretty familiar concept to us. But again, it's kind of that magical unicorn profile of a customer that's eager to pay your profitable price. They get it, you know, exactly the level of the organization you're talking to, you know, the category and subcategory you're talking to. And you're defining it from the perspective, not necessarily of how many are there, but of does this person best align with what I'm trying to achieve? Does this best align with my strategic intent? And a good example, continuing that moon landing story, is I would argue the ICP here was really the American people. A lot of people could argue it was the USSR because we were in the space race. A lot of people could argue, hey, it's really Congress because they pay the bills. Those are definitely parties that were involved. But for something like this to be successful, NASA and this program really had to focus on who cared the most, who was happy to pay the price, who would receive the most value. And in that case, that was definitely the American people as a whole. When you have those two, you've laid the foundation for your value proposition. That's where you take all your features, all the little things you can do, and you translate that into what's called value themes for that ideal customer. Those themes are what attract the customer. So you see in some cases, some of the value propositions here were, having the financial resources to achieve the moon landing, having the engineering resources, having the national alignment. But that all translates as a value theme into creating the belief for the American people, for that ICP, that yes, we can achieve this. And that's the difference between a product and a really good idea, is you've shown them, yes, this can be done. And you've created that belief in them. And then finally, defining your positioning. Positioning, I think some people can get stuck on this sometimes, because what does that mean? It's easiest for me to think about it just literally physically as your position. If anyone grew up playing sports, you can think about your position on the field and the way you would run in or out. But it's that angle of approach that puts you in that category of being the only viable option for your ICP. That's really how you start to differentiate. That's how you start to say, in a market full of whatever else we do, we're actually in a category all our own, because we're the only ones that do it this way. And what you care about most is this way. And that's that bottom statement of only the USA had the resources and commitment to achieve this goal. Now, there's a really important note here. This is more about belief. This is more about your ICP believing this and feeling this than about it being objectively true. And even in our space, there's not a lot of competitors with what we do, but there are two other companies that kind of do what we do. So positioning is where kind of science meets art, and becomes that marketing and sales story of I'm going to convince you essentially that my position, my value proposition is the only one for you. So that is, in my mind, go-to-market strategy top to bottom. There's a lot of little nuts and bolts that go into it, but that's more of a tactical level of pricing and channels and messaging and outreach and sales and stuff like that. But this, for me, is the playbook that I've been able to use repeatedly, and that's helping us be so successful with Empirix. Any questions, comments on this before we keep going?
One thing I wanted to add in here, Ethan, and I do think that defining the ICP and defining value proposition, I find them to be some of the hardest things to work with my founders. Do you have, I mean, I know, just taking a moment to pause, feel free to answer this during our Q&A, but do you have any best practices or tips with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we'll certainly talk about this in the discussion, but also happy to now. I think there's a huge difference between simple and easy. Running a marathon is a very simple thing to do, 26.2 miles in a straight line. It isn't an easy thing to do at all. And that's kind of where my focus is can we demystify this and make this a systematic thing? Yes. Is it hard? Absolutely. And I don't want to gloss over that at all. I think the best tip is to really focus on the strategic intent. If you can get your principal completely committed and aligned around what are we trying to achieve for the next quarter, half a year, 10 years, if you can really get that dialed in to where it's almost a dogma for them, it's easier at the ICP level to drive that focus. Because the fear I see them run into is they want the whole market. They want everyone. everyone can benefit from this. And that's all true. You just can't serve everyone at once. And depending on the stage you're in, especially if you're a new venture or more shifting into growth or hitting growth stage, excuse me, you're going to get in more trouble chasing mediocre opportunities than anything else. And so really, really investing the time to get very deep on the strategic intent, getting full alignment on that will make it easier to focus at the ICP stage and then at the value proposition stage. The other very practical tip is keep a very robust backlog that they can see and that you treat like it's your favorite thing ever. And so you sit there and you say, okay, we've got this first ICP and we're committing for the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to this one. But hey, boss, I heard you. We got number 2, number 3, and number 4 lined up. And 6 months from now at our pre-scheduled meeting, the first thing we're going to do is review performance against this ICP. And the second thing we're going to do is pull ICP number 2 in, put them head to head, see what we want to do. And it removes some of that fear they feel that they're going to lose this amazing idea down the road. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I can't wait to hear the rest of the rest of the tips. Thank you.
Absolutely. So if I can get my slides to continue. I don't like doing sales. I've never liked doing sales. I don't like anything about it. I don't enjoy it. It's just, we're being very successful right now and I still don't enjoy it. So I say that as the background of that's where I'm coming from with this. And it also informs the fact that sales is really just about connecting with the ICP. I think that especially in the US, there's a sales culture around being charismatic and talking people into things. And we maybe default to the used car salesman mentality or the realtor mentality where they're trying to get us to buy something we don't want. And I think that if you found yourself in the position of selling someone something they don't want, you need to back up a step because that's not your ICP. And it becomes a little dogmatic, a little circular, but I think that's a good thing. If you're having to argue with someone at the if you can't even figure out at the prospecting stage, is this probably a good target? You don't have enough focus on what you're trying to achieve. If you get to the lead stage and it's hard to prioritize one lead versus the other, there's misalignment on which one's more like your ICP or not. If you get to the intro stage and you've got to push and call and text and pester and follow up versus you reach out a couple times and they more come to you and it's an easier conversation, there's misalignment upstream. Same for the discovery process. If you've got really clear signals and you understand, okay, they're 70% aligned, that they've got some reasonable questions, that's very different from there's a bunch of messy signals and I don't know if they like our stuff or not, and they're completely misaligned with our pricing strategy. That's again a good example of there's not enough alignment upstream. Same for the proposal stage with the push-pull fit. At the negotiation stage, it should be much more focused on removing the 1 or 2 key obstacles, kind of a happy negotiation. If there's fundamental misalignment, if it's combative, y'all probably know by now, there's misalignment back upstream with the ICP. And finally, getting very quickly to a good deal, or really importantly, getting quickly to no deal is a good sign of focus on the go-to-market toolkit. If you're really slow to sign a bad deal or even a good deal, or to get to no deal, that's a big problem. And that's a place from my personal experience. I see businesses fail more often than not. It's not the bad deals. It's not the no deals. It's not the good deals. It's taking too long to get to an answer. Because in the meantime, it fills up your pipeline and it fills up your marketing team and it fills up your sales team and it lives as forecast revenue, even though it was never real. So this is my fundamental approach to sales, and there's more tactical stuff we can talk about, but you should use your go-to-market toolkit as a radical binary filter. Yes, no. This is a high percentage fit or this is not. And if it's not a high percentage fit, you shouldn't be spending any time on them. That's going to vary for everybody. I can show you all our ICP. We have it on a single slide during the discussion, but we have an internal standard of an 80% fit. If they're not 80% aligned with the 4 criteria we care about, we disengage. Obviously, we have to learn that during the sales process with intros and discovery, but we have backed out of many, many deals because we said there's just not enough alignment here. And then there's one qualifying statement at the top. It's our ICP core statement. If they don't align with that 100%, we don't talk to them. Now that'll vary a lot depending on what each of your organizations do. We have a few very big clients with very large contract values, but where I would see that varying is less on that radical binary fit and more on just being really thoughtful about how you define your ideal customer. But this is the only slide I have on sales directly, because when sales is radically aligned with that go-to-market strategy, with the strategic intent, with your ICP, with your value proposition, with your positioning, sales, I think, very much fits into a chief of staff mentality. We are just getting a relationship set up. We are just setting up the process of serving this customer. We're not in there trying to be Don Draper from Mad Men, just charismatically convincing people into things. It's just a matter of, okay, we all know intuitively how to get obstacles out of the way for there to be a good relationship. So that's my big lead behind for y'all, is that sales is about removing obstacles from good relationships. If you're fighting through bad relationships, there's been a problem upstream with your go-to-market toolkit. We're going to shift here in a second into the more day-to-day tactical stuff of kind of how to help your principal thrive and what they struggle with. So I want to pause for a second and see, is this resonating with folks? Does this feel kind of off? For my favorite question, does this feel too simple? Okay, I have perfectly delivered it. That's great.
Perfectly, Ethan. Perfectly.
All right. All right. This is my favorite slide of all time coming up, but I'm a consultant, so I just love PowerPoint decks. Helping your principal thrive. Your principal carries the burden of your organization's success. I say that as someone who's been a CEO who inherited a company during COVID. I've launched other organizations, I've led other things. They carry a burden that if you've not been in charge of a whole organization, it's very hard to understand. There are days when I was leading fledging where someone would introduce themselves and I would forget my name. There was just too much going on in my head. Someone would come to me with something that was a legitimate emergency, and it would just go on the pile of other legitimate emergencies. And so I think that's a moment of empathy right away, is just understanding, your principal is carrying a burden that's really hard to understand. So that positions them as the hero of the story, and that means that you need to be a guide. And my super nerdy example is, you jump back to Star Wars, right? And you got the rebellion success. It depended on Luke becoming a Jedi Master. Luke is the hero of that story. Luke is your principal. He's the CEO or the equivalent. They're leading that organization. It doesn't necessarily matter if you can do the job better than them, because your job is to help them be successful. It also matters because the person directly responsible, we call it the primary person responsible for something, has to be equipped to lead it. In that same example, Luke needed someone to show him the path and to keep him on it when he wanted to quit. Yoda is the kind of classic film guide. I always think about chiefs of staff as the Yodas of what we're doing. Obviously, the little green guy can jump in there and do lots of impressive things, and he has a ton of amazing skills, and he's an incredible pinch hitter and pioneer to get things started. But his main superpower is helping guide his principal or guide the organization to where it needs to be. The key theme for me, and my wife always laughs when I share this theme because this is not who I am personally, but the theme that rules everything is focus. I think that is the most practical, from an operational level, tactical level, and strategic level, day-to-day thing we can do, is we can help our principals focus. Every venture that's successful ultimately moves through one of 4 cycles. There's the launch cycle, just getting started. You can think about it that as pre-revenue, pre-MVP, just on the other side of revenue and MVP. If you're in maybe a spin-off business or a new business line, this is right when it gets started and it's trying to find its way in the market. And you're really focused on establishing traction, and that's defined by experimenting rapidly, having binary focus. It's hell yes or hell no. And then winning those first logos, those first clients, those first users that validate there's something here. I don't say anything about profitable logos because it's typically just about getting that first proof in the market. You move on to the growth stage. You're talking about scaling recurring revenue. You've probably got a decent sense of product market fit. You're still experimenting rapidly, and maybe your focus tolerance can reduce to like 80%, because you do have to go from winning those early adopters to starting to win a mass market. So your ICP definition is going to change. And you start to see a mix of winning revenue and logos. As your organization has maturity, it's all about profiting and planning. So you want to experiment carefully because you're wanting to continue doing what works, and you don't want to be radically changing things all the time because you are at scale. You want to grow from the core of your business. So finding what you're good at, and then finding kind of the first cousins, the very next adjacency to what you're doing, and then all focused on maximizing cash flow or the equivalent for what you're doing. And then finally, there's the decline or renewal stage. And this is when your segment's matured. You have to evolve. A lot of companies just fail. They go away. A lot maintain, and they find a niche to really dig down deep into to continue working on. or they extend. They add new product lines, they do spin-off businesses, they experiment very strategically, and they restart from launch if that's a spin-off, and sometimes they restart from launch. And we've seen some companies in the last 20 years somehow, despite being worth hundreds of billions of dollars, be radically successful in keeping this launch growth mentality, even as they're giant companies. I think Apple is a great example, is somehow, despite them being maybe the biggest company in history, they've been able to generally maintain this cultural approach to being more in the launch growth stage all the time. I share all this, and a lot of it may be very familiar, but go-to-market and sales can seem very different at each stage, but it's mostly the same all the time, and we can step through that. I'm curious, real quick, just to get a sense of everybody on the call, where are you in this? Is your company in the launch stage, the growth stage, and the maturity stage, or maybe even in the decline and renewal stage? Barely at launch, I feel that in my bones. Growth stage. Kate, when you said all of the above, can you share a little more about that?
My current principal is a serial entrepreneur, and we have 3 businesses under our parent company and multiple products under those businesses. And so each of the products are kind of in different stages. And so it kind of depends on what part of the business you're looking at, if you know it, to kind of determine where we're at.
That sounds like a lot of fun, and also like I would be spending a lot of money on whiskey every week.
Yeah. And I don't like cheap whiskey, so it's an expensive job right now.
So I imagine there's kind of a lot of complexity and a lot of tendency with your principal right now to really overlap everything and to not want to split out the different focuses. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's a ton of overlap and everybody's working on everything.
Yeah, that's really tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah.
I think I saw a launch with an ironic laugh as well. Isaiah, what are y'all focused on?
So I'm a chief of staff at a school of public health that also deeply dives into research. We have a diagnostic tool that we think could be very productive, very powerful. But I'm only a year into the job, and getting to even try to launch this product has been a 5 or 6 year endeavor. So that's why I say we're barely at launch. I'm really just doing some early research, conversations with stakeholders, and that's why I'm here today, just to kind of hear about some best practices from folks who've done it already.
I worked in the supply chain for a major academic health system for a couple of years, and working with academic physicians is really exciting and really cool. And also, I'll default back to my whiskey comment. That could be very challenging.
Absolutely. They're brilliant minds, but they lean on us for the business side of it, and it can be a very slow conversation. Like I said, this has been going on for 4 or 5 years before me, so hopefully it doesn't take as long to maybe get to the next step.
Absolutely. I've noticed too a tendency for them to say, well, conceptually or on paper, this should work. So just go do it. It's like, that's great, but that's not how a market works.
Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense. So I want to step through these. For me, it's been successful kind of evolving with the principle. And so what I'll share here is my journey with Empirix. This is kind of a day in the life. Results will obviously vary a lot, but for me, focusing on constant alignment with what your principal is really strong at and how your organization needs to grow is important. And that creates a lot of permission to say no to things, to in a lot of ways be that gatekeeper to say, hey, this is not aligned with our strategic intent at all. This really needs to wait till the next time. So the launch phase, the way I really think about myself is as a go-to-market advisor. He needs to make a lot of decisions. I really need to support them. And I'm here to be a subject matter expert on the go-to-market toolkit. So I functionally own the strategy toolbox or toolkit, which is the 4 tools we talked about before. I'm still very much supporting operations and delivery. Key activities, I support all strategic and sales discussions. During that phase, which was the first 9 months, I was in every single discussion that involved strategic considerations, tactical considerations, and every sales discussion, every call, every visit, every meeting. It was exhausting, to be totally honest. I went from not having a Delta Sky Miles account to I will be platinum this year, which is yay. But I think it's very necessary because there's such a density of learning. And it also gives you an opportunity to keep them on the rails, right? to keep what my dad likes to call the good idea fairy from landing on their shoulder and say, wouldn't it be a good idea if, and then they just propose a quick software update that's actually a year and a new product and a whole rebuild. And it's easy to tease them and poke fun at them, but I've also been that CEO where you're sitting there trying so hard, doing everything you can to help that organization succeed, maybe not taking pay. Maybe you've got your house mortgaged into this. Maybe your career is on the line and they're just trying to do everything they can. And so what I found to be successful is my principle is very, very strong in ideation, big picture thinking, understanding kind of the art of the possible and what can be. And my partnership is set up with him to where he turns to me to very rigorously and quantitatively kind of evaluate those. So he's not saying you have to do all these things. He's saying I have all these ideas. I need my partner, me, to help him kind of qualify those and prioritize those. And it brings a lot of peace to them to run it through that go-to-market toolkit, because it's not just me saying no. It's saying, hey, we have the strategic intent. You need to help me understand how this is a tier 1 opportunity to support that, or we definitely need to pause this. And the deliverables, I own all the strategy and sales documentation. Every story we tell, every slide we share, everything we share internally and externally, I was the keeper of that. And it gave me some authority with him to say, hey, it's your job to have ideas, it's my job to translate them, and then together we can be successful. Moving ahead to growth, shifted a little bit more to go-to-market tactician because we had the go-to-market strategy set. We still review it, but we used to review it every month and then every 3 months, and now we do it every 6 months, and that's going to stretch out to a year soon. And so with those longer periods, it becomes more important to think about how we're doing these things. So I continued owning the toolbox, but I'm also responsible for integration. It's really important there. Integration for me is not the same thing as implementation and delivery. Integration is I am making sure that there's a handoff from the sales team to the delivery or operations team. I'm making sure that the delivery team understands our strategy and speaks our language. I'm fielding questions from them, sometimes really good challenges, sometimes not so good ones. But I'm making sure that there's a bridge from what we want to do to how we're going to do it. Continue supporting ops and delivery activities, all the previous activities, plus the integration, and then revising the documents and starting to build out supporting processes is important. So a really good example is we've sold a couple of very high dollar value accounts recently, and we looked up and said, whoops, we did a pretty bad job bringing the project manager up to speed on all the history of how we sold this deal and all the internal conflicts with the client and all the objections. And we just didn't educate him properly to go serve this account. And so I went in and built a supporting process that said, hey, we bring the PM earlier in on sales. We create this kind of intro lead level summary. Here's how we make a decision for discovery. Here's how we document lessons learned. Here's how we document watchouts and stuff like that. Move ahead to maturity. I don't know. I just got here in the grand scheme of things. We're not mature yet. We're still growing. I might end up becoming a leader of a business function. I think more likely I'm going to help my principal launch some new ventures in a studio model, but throughout it, I'm always hyper-focused on the toolkit. My ultimate success or failure is measured by leadership and integration of that toolkit. And then finally, the decline or renewal stage, I would obviously just run the toolkit either for the business function I'm running or return to that launch go-to-market advisor role for any new ventures we want to spin up. I want to pause there, see if there's any questions or if anyone even maybe wants to dive into the specifics of where they are in any of these stages to kind of talk through what you want to do.
Hi, Ethan. I have a quick question. How do you determine if you're a good fit for a particular principal or not? Because you guys are in such close collaboration. What are some things you look for in this relationship?
That's a good question. I've known my principal for a really long time. We started our careers together at Georgia Pacific. He used to hit me in the head with a bouncy ball when I was on conference calls. I was in his wedding. He's a Marine veteran. I grew up in a military family, so we have a lot of shared culture and background. Obviously, people can't just reproduce that process. But I also had another friend with a similar path who also wanted me to be his chief of staff. And I said no to him and yes to my principal, because I sat in that room with my principal and basically took him to task. And like I said, when we started, got 400 questions deep before I finally found something he didn't know. And not once did he get frustrated or angry with me or try and shut down or get defensive. We had hard conversations. He and I butt heads pretty hard sometimes and disagree on a lot of things. We've worked crazy long weeks. We've had big deals come through and big deals lost. And never once has he rounded on me and said the equivalent of sit down and shut up, or why are you asking me this question, or why can't you just leave this topic alone? And I think that's, for me, the defining factor, because you have to be in this role where you're challenging the hell out of them, poking holes in all their ideas and telling them no about things that they're convinced is yes, and telling them the cost of doing their magic dream thing. And they have to see you as someone who's an enabler for them in the best sense. You're telling them if this can be real or not. They can't experience you as someone who's just there to say no and kind of shut down the party. So it's hard to evaluate that, but I think we also have all been in that spot where we're talking with someone and you can feel it. You can feel that they're in it with you and they value you, and they may disagree and they may end up overriding you, and they've decided, but they heard you out, they took you seriously, and then they made an informed decision. I think that fit, that ability to challenge hard and often and be appreciated for it, is probably the most important thing.
Thanks, Ethan. These are really insightful.
For sure. I saw Hope's question. Let me read it. Sorry, I can read it out loud. Sorry. Hope asked, where do you place the transition from founder-led sales team to a separate sales team, and how can the chief of staff support that transition? And how do you find good salespeople? One at a time. I think from founder-led to separate sales team, one, it's going to depend on your business model. We sell $4 million 24 and 36-month contracts. I don't know that we'll ever leave founder-led, but not everyone's in that market space. Not everyone's in that dynamic. I think generally speaking, when you can run a highly predictable pipeline, that this many prospects turns into this many leads, turns into this many intros, turns into this many proposals, this many negotiations, into these dollars. And generally speaking, if I put in X amount of effort, we will see Y amount of growth. It's become very systematized. That's when you're really going to want to shift to that sales team. And I say that because most salespeople aren't primed for learning. They're operators. I know we kind of flinch at that as chiefs of staff, but they're operators just like a plant operator. They're showing up to take a widget and run it a million times. You can't pass on that valuable learning, all that intensity and density of learning in the early stages. Another way of saying it is, until you have confidence that you could sit down and build a really great PowerPoint deck that could very reliably train a new salesperson to do exactly what you're doing, you're probably not quite ready for the handoff yet. The one caveat there is, if you can find a sales leader who you can really partner with well, who's on your leadership team and likes rolling up their sleeves as much as they like doing strategy work, and they finish your sentences and you trust them and they trust you, I think you could do that sooner. But for most people, that's really hard to find, because most salespeople are incentivized by volume and commission, and they're just not doing more of that strategic thought stuff. Let me go back to the second part of your question. How do you support the transition? I think having a really, really rigorous go-to-market toolkit. You've got your story defined, your value proposition defined. Your team makes fun of you because they know you're going to talk about the ICP today, that you're the first person they look to when someone veers off the strategic intent, when they're ahead of you, and then they're really, really just kind of echoing what you're trying to teach them. I think you've prepared them well. Obviously, systems are really important, processes are really important, but if they get it, if they get strategic intent informs the ICP informs the value prop informs the positioning informs sales. This is our sales process. You've helped them be really successful. If they're constantly coming to you with exceptions, what if we served this customer and all we had to do was modify the product a little? I don't think they quite get it yet. How do you find good salespeople? I have no idea. Do you know? I've never successfully hired a salesperson. I have no idea. All right, getting very close to the end. Resources I love. Everything shared today comes directly out of these 3 books. I think April Dunford, Walks on Water. She takes what I think is a very informed marketing-led approach. The first one is a book called Obviously Awesome. It's really the go-to-market toolkit. It drives you through understanding your customer, your value proposition, your unique differentiation. She uses language a little bit differently than I do. You're probably not going to see strategic intent in there, but all in all, this is our Bible. This is our standard for the go-to-market toolkit. She published a book after that called Sales Pitch. If you've done Obviously Awesome, Sales Pitch is going to be the easiest thing you've ever done, because you just take what you did here and you take Sales Pitch and you make the slides she says to make and you do it. And that becomes your standard sales pitch. Some people have a pitchable product. You know, we go and do hour-long demos and discussions and yada yada. Some people sell stuff that has to be bought through 2 clicks on a video and an ad. I would do sales pitch all the same, because what you can do if you're on that high volume side or that video demo side is you can take that and you can hand it to your marketing team and say, I hear you have to make a 30-second video. Here's the template. Make this into whatever format it needs to be in. So that becomes your master resource and reference for everything. And then being the guide can be a different mentality shift. Donald Miller's book, Building Story Brand, it's really interesting. It'll help inform a lot of the other stuff. It'll really, really help you understand your ideal customer persona. It'll really help you empathize with your customer, because your customer wants to be the hero as much as your principal wants to be the hero. But the overall takeaway from it is that mentality shift to how to be the guide. So those are the 3 key resources. You could listen to me talk about this a lot, or you could go get those 3 books, maybe work through them in a couple weekends, and you can show up to your principal and seem like an absolute magician, because you have given them a framework for turning all the chaos up here into something testable. All right. And last but not least, I'd love to learn from people. For instance, I don't know how to hire good salespeople. I'm bad at it. I think we're really strong when working together. So please reach out to me. I'm obviously in the Ask a Chief of Staff community on Slack. I'm not great about checking Slack, as Nia knows well. But you can text me, you can call me, text me first. You can find me on LinkedIn. And obviously there's my email. So I love talking about this stuff. I love helping people think through stuff, and I learn so much every single time. So would love to continue to support y'all as well.
Then that was fantastic. There's 2 questions that were in the chat. I want to make sure they get answered as well, if in the next 2 minutes. But one question is, how do you differentiate between the tactician while focusing on building your strategic chops while in the growth stage?
I think what is strategic for one level of responsibility is tactical for another. You think about being, like in our case, a vice president of delivery versus, you know, the CEO and the chief of staff. What would be very strategic for them would be very tactical for us. And so I think it's a matter of understanding your scope and your responsibility and saying, what do I need to be strategic on within my space? So maybe the leadership team's aligned around the strategic intent. It's then up to the delivery team to translate that into their team's strategy for how to achieve that strategic intent. So I think you can do both at once. I think tactics also deeply inform strategy, because as great as strategy is, you know, you go back to the moon landing example. If we'd figured out tactically it was $2 trillion in 1960, there's a fundamental problem with the strategy. And so instead of kind of thinking as one is done forever and then you just do the other, they really push and pull and inform each other. And I've seen people learn to do both well when they kind of can be in that strategic mindset and then shift to that tactical mindset and then push back to that strategic mindset. So letting one inform the other, like any good system should.
Perfect. And I do want to give Ethan, if you have just a couple more minutes, does
Yeah.
anyone else have other questions? I know we've got our expert here, so feel free to unmute yourself or type your question in the chat. We've got room for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Maybe I'll double dip here and go for a second one. I guess in the framework you showed where you had strategic intent, the ideal customer profile, and two other blocks, it seemed like there's a lot of, and you said you experiment rapidly. Do you visualize this as a couple of knobs that you have to play around with constantly till you get the secret sauce? Or do you have a different mental model to go about this?
Absolutely, yes. The thing I will say is we try and take more of a experimental approach. For instance, when we set the first ICP, that was in August, we said between now and December, we're changing nothing. It doesn't matter who calls, it doesn't matter what opportunities there are. We are radically focused on this ICP. And then we got to December, checked our feedback, counted our sales cycles, and said, okay, we need to modify it about 25%. Okay, for the next 3 months, we're radically focused on that. So there's a lot of knobs to play with, a lot of dials to play with. But it's also important to not be tweaking stuff all the time. You kind of need to move in waves or stages. Because if you look back at the end of the stage and you've had 10 sales runs and they've each been different to a different customer with a different value prop, you don't know what worked or what didn't. This is how we landed on one where we reliably convert about 40% of prospects to closed deals. Because we know exactly what works and what didn't and where we failed at each stage before.
Makes sense. All right. Thanks again, Ethan.
Real quick, I can show you all that as well. So we put this in our sales deck. Again, these are very, very high dollar value accounts for us. So it's important to think about a long-term relationship. A typical client for us could end up being $50 to $100 million over 5 years. So that first engagement is really important. Our binary yes, no statement is they have to be an innovative, that means data center developer, owner operator, entering a new market to support 2 specific client types, co-location and hyperscale. If they're not that, we don't talk to them. We just don't. It's just not worth it. And then there's the 4 a little bit softer criteria. They have to have the right mentality with a certain scale of pipeline. They have to have smart, unified leadership who values supply chain. They have to have really high sensitivity to go-to-market risk that supply chain can solve, and they have to have the financial resources ready to support growth. This for us is where the kind of percentage comes in, and this is where they have to hit 80% of us. That doesn't look like 3 yeses and 1 no. That looks like, okay, we think their leadership values supply chain, but there are some questions. So maybe we give them a 70 on that. But dang, they're getting the mentality is through the roof. They get a 100 on that. So that's a little less binary. And then we have a very clear line of sight on who the stakeholders have to be. We have to be talking to senior leadership. We have a very clear value proposition. We create schedule success and portfolio acceleration. So we don't talk about cost avoidance and cost savings. And then timing people who want to get us involved as early as possible. We wiggle a little more on those bottom ones. So kind of the top statement's binary. The second statement's got a high threshold. The third section's a little more wiggle. But we've been really successful focusing on this because it frees us for focusing on people who don't value supply chain and have small scale pipelines and don't have financial resources. And they're making me talk to a supply manager when I have to be talking to a COO. Just frees us from getting bogged down in stuff that's going to consume our resources and slow us down. Also, if anyone here is building supply chain or building data centers or related to it, I would love to connect. Cool. Any other questions? Anything I can help with? Any feedback? Anything at all?
There is one last question, and this one I'm also very curious about. So taking it back to kind of the personal career adventures, Ethan, what was the most surprising perspective when you moved from being a CEO to a chief of staff?
I knew that I was stressed out as a CEO. I didn't have a good understanding of just what it looks like from the outside. And it's tough with really professional CEOs because they're professionals at kind of containing themselves. But it's terrifying, not for me as chief of staff, but for analysts and new hires and associates and entry-level talent, essentially, to engage with the CEO. And I didn't realize how scary that person in that role can seem, which really can have a very negative effect on young team members, new team members, people trying to learn the organization. And it's something I've tried to coach my principal through a lot. It's also something where, as silly as it sounds, I also remind him daily to drink water, and I made him take a vacation And it's just the stress management matters a lot. I had no clue how stressed out I was as CEO until I lived through it and then came out the other side with a much less stressful role and was able to witness that on a firsthand basis.
Wow, that is a remarkable insight. Thank you so much for sharing. It's a very unique one too, because we often don't get a lot of guest speakers come into our community who have had the perspective of being a CEO and a chief of staff. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on go-to-market and sales, as well as sharing your career adventures with us. You're probably seeing in the chat, Ethan, there is a wall of positive feedback for you from our community. Just a big thank you on behalf of Ask a Chief of Staff, of all of us here today, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and for answering all of our questions and for giving us a freaking tactical toolkit to use. So thank you. Ethan,
Absolutely.
thank you so much. And for everyone here today, please go ahead and connect with him on LinkedIn or send him a Slack message too. That works. But I think
LinkedIn might be safer. Yeah.
And on that note, have a great rest of your day, everyone. We'll see you soon. We've got many more events coming up. Thank you again, Ethan. Bye, everyone.